ticklish business any way you look at it. Come on, we'll stick together.
It's Ticklish Business, the podcast devoted to honoring and deconstructing the world of classic cinema. As always, I'm your host, Kristen Lopez. This month, Lauren Humphries-Brooks joins me as we honor actor John Dall, and we start by looking at his turn as a murderous college student in the 1948 Alfred Hitchcock film, Rope.
That's the last time she ever saw him alive. And that's the last time you'll ever see him alive. What happened to David Kentley changed my life completely, and the lives of 7 others. Janet Walker, Henry Kentley, the boy's father, his aunt, Mrs. Atwater, his best friend, Kenneth Lawrence, a housekeeper named Mrs. Wilson, and the 2 who were responsible for everything, Brandon Shaw and Philip Morgan.
Now, before we discuss Rope, it's important to honor our celebrant, John Dall, who's technically not celebrating his centennial. It's erroneously reported that he was born on May 26 of 1918, but he was actually born on that day in 1920. Now, we're going to honor our agreement and celebrate him anyway, but technically he is cheating. John Dall grew up comfortably in New York City until he moved with his family to Panama, where his civil engineer father was building an airport there. It was in Panama that Dall was initially bitten by the acting bug. In 1929, his father committed suicide, and John returned back to the United States. He briefly attended Columbia after high school, where he hoped to enter the family business of civil engineering. But acting was just too strong, and he left school to work with various theater troupes. In 1942, he received his first lead role on Broadway, playing the interestingly named character Quiz Martin in the Maxwell Anderson-written show The Eve of St. Mark. Jack Warner was in the audience of The Eve of St. Mark and offered Dall a screen test. And the test must have been successful because Dall signed his first 7-year contract with the stipulation that he could continue to perform on stage when he wanted to. He made his film debut in 1945 opposite Bette Davis in The Corn is Green. The role secured him his first and last Oscar nomination. But despite being labeled one of Hollywood's, quote, hottest finds, Warner didn't actually capitalize on this, and Dall went back to the stage, playing the lead in Dear Ruth. Now, if you listen to our episode from Sunset Boulevard when we talked about William Holden, Dear Ruth was one of the films that William Holden made, so the eventual adaptation didn't actually star John Dall, who had played the role originally on the stage. But by 1946, it really didn't matter, because after making just one film with Warner's, the studio let him go.
I've always thought it was out of character for David to drink anything as corrupt as whiskey.
Out of character for him to be murdered, too.
Yes, wasn't it? Good Americans usually die young on the battlefield, don't they? Well, the Davids of this world merely occupy space, which is why he was the perfect victim for the perfect murder. Of course, he was a Harvard undergraduate. That might make it justifiable homicide.
After leaving Warner's, Dall eventually worked his way up to talking to David O. Selznick, who signed him to join Vanguard Films. But even there, David O. Selznick didn't really give him anything of substance. It wasn't until Alfred Hitchcock freed himself of Selznick's influence that Dall would get the break he needed. Like Dall's casting, Rope wasn't the first choice for Hitchcock's next project. Hitchcock originally hoped to direct Under Capricorn, but Ingrid Bergman's unavailability put the project on the back burner. Then Hitch wanted to make a modern interpretation of Hamlet starring Cary Grant. Let's imagine that for a second, because it sounds fantastic. The director's third idea was what they ended up going with, an adaptation of the infamous Leopold and Loeb murders, the story of 2 college classmates who murder a young friend of theirs in order to prove they can pull off the perfect crime. Rope got its start from the play Rope's End, written by Patrick Hamilton, and the original material was a frank exploration of the murders, as well as the homosexual relationship between the 2 killers, material that would be ill-suited for film audiences of 1948. Hitchcock made appropriate changes to the script with the help of screenwriters Hume Cronin and Arthur Laurence, but the final product pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable regarding sexuality at the time.
Well, it happened about 3 years ago in Connecticut. Mother has a place there, you know. We were going to have chickens, so we walked over to the farm. It was a lovely Sunday morning in late spring. Across the valley, the church bells were ringing, and in the yard, Philip was doing likewise to the necks of 2 or 3 chickens.
Oh, dear.
It was a task he usually performed very competently. But on this particular morning, his touch was perhaps a trifle too delicate. Because one of the subjects for our dinner table suddenly rebelled. Like Lazarus, he rose...
That's a lie.
Philip.
There isn't a word of truth in the whole story. I never strangled a chicken in my life.
Now, look here, Philip.
I never strangled a chicken, and you know it.
Rope was Alfred Hitchcock's most experimental film up to that point, as well as his first feature in Technicolor. He dabbled in gimmicks before, from impressive crane shots in Notorious to using large props in Spellbound. And after Rope, Hitchcock worked with 3D in Dial M for Murder. Here, Hitch hoped to create the entire film on one set in a single uninterrupted take. The director thought the single takes would cut down on editing and the budget overall, but this was not to be. Half the movie had to be reshot when Hitchcock discovered the developed film had distorted the matte painting of the sunset he was using. Actors couldn't afford to flub lines or ask for additional takes, and James Stewart became incredibly frustrated, asking if Hitch was so intent on recreating live theater, why didn't he just set up seats and sell tickets? Rope was not a commercial success upon release in 1948, though the master of suspense wasn't willing to give up on the single take notion, and he did it again in his eventual adaptation of Under Capricorn, another movie audiences didn't come out in droves for. Hitchcock considered Rope a failed experiment, and while it gave John Dall his strongest notices up to that point, it didn't give his career much of a boost. After the break, Lauren Humphries-Brooks and I dig deeper to look into the world of Rope.
This world and the people in it have always been dark and incomprehensible to me. And I've tried to clear my way with logic and superior intellect. And you've thrown my own words right back in my face, Brandon. You were right, too. If nothing else, a man should stand by his words. But you've given my words a meaning that I never dreamed of. And you've tried to twist them into a cold, logical excuse for your ugly murder. Oh, they never were that, Brandon. And you can't make them that.
We are starting the month of May honoring a new Centennial celebrant. We are talking about actor John Dall. I did not know a lot about John Dall before I selected him for this month. I knew he'd been in Rope, and I knew he'd been in Gun Crazy, and that's literally all I knew. I hadn't really paid attention to him, so we're going to change that this month by talking about Rope and Gun Crazy. We're going to talk about the ones people know, but hopefully we'll learn some stuff in the process. And I am joined this month by guest Lauren Humphries-Brooks. You might recall from the episode that we did about Christmas in Connecticut. She's been on a couple of times. Lauren, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well.
Lauren, in case people did not listen to your previous appearances, which if they have not, they should, because I think our Christmas in Connecticut episode was really fun, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are on the Twitterverse?
On the Twitterverse, I'm a very loud feminist tweeter, film critic. I work with you on Citizen Dame. Just in terms of the applicability of this particular episode, I studied Hitchcock all the way through graduate school, and I love Hitchcock. Absolutely favorite director of all time, and I'm really excited to talk about Rope because I love Rope.
When I asked people about who they wanted to guest star for which actors, you actually picked John Dall.
Yeah, I like John Dall a lot.
Having not known about him as a person before, why don't you give us the overview of why you love John Dall?
Well, like most people, the primary films that I know him from are Rope and Gun Crazy, but I think that he's just so impressive in both of those films. We'll get more into him, obviously, in terms of talking about the film, but he's just this very charming, attractive presence with also that undercurrent of just sadism. And I love that about him as an actor, and then it's very much a conflict to what he does in Gun Crazy, where he's actually a very sweet character who's sort of pulled along by the violence in his life and by the people that he cares about. He didn't have a very long career. I think he died at the age of 50, and he really only appeared in a few big films, among them Rope, Gun Crazy, and he was also famously in Spartacus, which was one of his last roles. But he had a big stage career, and was sort of one of those actors that was supposed to be big. He was contracted a number of times, and he was supposed to be in a number of different films, and then they just never panned out, or they never really turned into anything. Someone on Twitter mentioned that he's like Christian Bale in American Psycho, and I think that that's a really good comparison. He's that charming and totally insane at the same time.
John Dall, to me, in looking over his biography, is a lot like Paul Muni or George Raft, where he's more known for the movies that he didn't make.
Mm-hmm.
He originated in Dear Ruth in the 1940s on stage, which when they made the movie, he was not in it. But it also had Lauren Bacall and Faye Emerson, a bunch of other people that were not in the finished product. And then when he was working with a couple of other studios, he was supposed to be in, I think it was Shadow of Fear with Michael Cortes, but then that didn't happen. A lot of roles that he was supposed to play just never really panned out, and that's always frustrating to see with certain actors when you hear about certain performances that they were supposed to give. I've seen Rope twice now, so this is the second time I've seen it, and I think the first time I wasn't quite paying attention to it, so I didn't really care for it. It's still not my favorite Hitchcock movie. Might be sacrilege to Lauren.
It's not my favorite Hitchcock, but I think it is one of his best.
I do appreciate a lot of what Hitchcock is trying to achieve here in terms of technique and acting. When people say this is his most controversial film, I think it is on a lot of different levels. I don't think he ever really tried to do something on this level again. Mostly because it didn't necessarily pan out. This movie was not critically beloved when it came out. It's only been in the years since that there's been this aura of cool to it. Let's throw out the plot real quick before we get lost into deconstructing it. Loosely based on the Leopold and Loeb murders, it involves two young men, one played by Farley Granger, the other played by John Dall, Philip and Brandon, respectively, who live together, that's the assumption, who decide to kill an inferior classmate and then hide his body in their apartment, and then invite a bunch of friends and family, the murdered classmate's family, to this dinner party, along with a professor of theirs played by James Stewart, in the hopes of proving that they are superior and thus have gotten away with the perfect crime. You might remember this movie being remade in the early 2000s with Ryan Gosling and Michael Pitt. This isn't remade, but it's the same story, Murder by Numbers, which is not a great movie, but it's the same kind of basic idea. They've done the story a lot, the Leopold and Loeb case. Yeah. I don't think many of them follow the Leopold and Loeb case specifically, though, right?
No, there is a film, I think it was in the 1960s, and right now I'm struggling to remember the title, but it stars Orson Welles, that is specifically about Leopold and Loeb, that it is that story and what happened in it. This plays sort of a riff on the original murder.
Compulsion is the movie that Lauren's thinking of, from 1959, with Dean Stockwell in it. Interesting.
It's actually a very interesting film, an interesting depiction of the whole story. It all takes place over the course of one evening. Compulsion, you go through the murder, the trial, the relationship between the two men, the relationship between them and the Orson Welles, who plays Clarence Darrow, who defends them. It's much murkier and more about the social implications of this killing.
Well, you brought up American Psycho.
Yeah.
I really love American Psycho. It's one of my favorite movies, which probably says a lot about me. What Rope does really well, and we've seen this done in other movies, and Hollywood really loved it. They love talking about the Superman, the Nietzsche construct of this male entitlement and how certain men are exceptional and must control others. A great example, and my mother's going to roll her eyes when I bring it up, is The Seawolf. 1942's The Seawolf, which I just saw at TCM, which is all about the Superman and the ego and the id and all of that. It's a great movie. But here you get a lot of proselytizing from Brandon about how they are superior beings. This movie is all about white male entitlement in 1948, and I really enjoy that because, if anything, that's only made the movie age somewhat better in the era that we have right now, where we're slowly looking at male privilege and how that plays out. So watching these two men, one of whom you could argue is not superior, because Farley Granger's character has a conscience. He's scared. He's a weakling.
I'm not certain whether he has a conscience. He's scared, and he's afraid of being caught, and that's what constantly just keeps on replaying. but he never expresses particular remorse for having committed the murder. At one point he says, I keep on thinking that we'll wake up and we haven't done it. But he never says, like, I wish that David was still alive. You know, I wish that I hadn't killed my friend. Because this is someone that they've known for a long time, that they've been friends with, and that they invited over specifically to murder. I'm not convinced that Philip is like, oh, I feel bad about this. Just like, I'm afraid I'm going to get caught and it's eating me away.
What I noticed about this movie is how, by contrast to how grandiose of a character Brandon is, I internalize that as, oh, it's remorse, just because he actually does have an emotion about it. Maybe that's what it is. It's the fact that he's not just like, haha, I totally killed a guy. I think of something like Sal Mineo in Rebel Without a Cause, that there's a puniness to Farley Granger in here that's totally different than the other movie about two dudes that want to plan a murder, which is Strangers on a Train, where he plays a very different character.
Yeah, in Rope he's very weak. He gets progressively drunk as the evening goes on. Everything that happens frightens him. He thinks that the second that everyone walks in, that they know. Whereas Brandon is so deeply involved in his own ego that he really believes throughout most of the film, like, we're never going to get caught. I can do whatever I want to and make fun of these people, and they're not going to catch on to what is happening.
Well, I think what makes his character work is that if this was any other movie with any other script, the concept of a guy inviting a bunch of people over, especially a person who is just as smart as them, if not smarter, a professor who knows murders, it's a really stupid idea when you really think about it. Like, why would he do this? But it's that ego, it's that pride, it's that concept of, I am so much smarter, where you do believe that his logic makes sense in a way.
Yeah, well, and he's performing at some level for Rupert, for the Jimmy Stewart character. He wants to show off what he's done. At one point they talk about him being, you know, the boy sitting at the master's knee. And that's his attitude. He's just like, I've done this amazing thing, this thing that you have only talked about, but I have actually accomplished. And I want to kind of show you how cool I am, but at the same time, you can't reveal it, obviously, because he's committed a murder and he's afraid that they will be arrested, that Rupert really wouldn't understand. I agree with you. The degree of ego that he shows, the whole opening sequence where the two of them are talking about having this party, and at one point, Philip is, we shouldn't be doing this, this is a bad idea, you know, we've got to get rid of the body, and he's right. At a logical level, he's frightened, but he's also right. But Brandon is very much like, no, we have to put on this show. And it really is a show just for the two of them, and really just for Brandon, because there's no purpose to it. They could get rid of the body very easily, but they don't. They leave it in the middle of the room for the entire film.
And I mean, if you look at Nietzsche's theories of the Ubermensch and the Superman, I mean, a lot of it I think is somewhat confusing just because it's so dense with material. A lot of it is this aspiration that life is given meaning by how a new generation is advanced. You're coming out of post-World War II, where the war ended in 45 and we're in 48. There's this time of relative prosperity, but it comes at the expense of a lot of death and destruction, and we're slowly starting to come out of it. So watching these two characters, we're never really told how old they are, but the assumption is that they're young, about, 21?
Well, I think that it's mentioned that David is Harvard undergraduate, and it's implied that all of them were at prep school together, so they're all in, relatively that area, so they're 21, 22 years old.
In theory, they probably haven't served, but they've lived in struggle. Yeah. They've seen what has happened. And it's this concept of the new generation having this cynicism and this nihilism to the world, that they've seen the horrors that can be wrought. And they're just like, screw it. Whatever, life has no meaning anymore.
But it's also what they're being taught. Part of what Brandon and Philip are talking about is that they're talking about things that Rupert taught them.
Yes.
And in fact, you get a lot of that. It's a funny sequence, but it's also very horrifying considering what the audience knows and what the other characters don't know. When Rupert is sitting there talking about, we should have open season on murder. And you should be allowed to, kill someone who's interfering in your daily life, who is inferior in some way. And of course, in his view, he's making a joke, but you also figure this is something that he said or imparted to boys at a very, very young and impressionable age. And obviously at least 2 of them took it to heart.
It's really interesting to look at what Hollywood was making in the late 40s into the 50s, and what this movie is saying almost about not just necessarily the world, but filmmaking in general. I mean, it's a really dark film where it's adhering to everything the code is laying out. And we'll talk about it when we get to the ending. It's an authentic and realistic and ultimately dour Hollywood story. As a piece of art, it's just very interesting to look at it in the grand scheme of late 40s films that Hollywood's making. I think of stuff like Esther Williams movies and the movies of the 50s, the musicals. You look at 50s movies and I think that a lot of people assume they're very happy and positive, the shaking off the war trappings.
Yeah.
And this is just saying, like, no, things are only going to get worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Iranian talking about is that amorality. It's not even like Brandon and Philip have essentially constructed their own sort of moral code. They've decided that they're allowed to eliminate someone that they consider to be inferior. So they're not doing something evil as far as they know. They're doing something natural. Of course, we should be allowed to murder people that are inferior to us. This man is inferior, we're going to kill him. And then we're going to essentially parade his corpse for his family. I always love that, though. Like, they invited his fiancée, his best friend, his mother and father, and it turns out his mother can't come and his aunt winds up coming, to eat dinner in the same room as his corpse. When you really think about the plot of the film, that is pretty screwed up.
You watch something like, and I'm not even assuming these 2 movies are thinking the same way, Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Yeah.
You know, where they're essentially eating the body of this person that they've murdered, and you're like, oh my god, it's really a notch away from just cannibalism.
Well, and Brandon refers to it as like, because they serve the dinner off of the chest David is concealed in. It's like a sacrificial altar. You're like, are you kidding me?
A lot of the evil is just so cavalier from him. It's so flippant. So we gotta talk about John Dall because he is the star of the month. Monty Clift was the original choice. We seem to be having Monty Clift pop up a lot because he was also supposed to be in Sunset Boulevard, and he was not. And it doesn't say why he left this project. Could go with the obvious route. We all know that Montgomery Clift was gay, which I don't know if Hitchcock went for him intentionally because of the content of the film. There's a couple reasons I don't think Monty Clift would have worked. Part of it is the fact that Hollywood did know he was gay, and I almost wonder how that would play to audiences now. Not at the time because they didn't know, but now that we all know the background, would it have just been too on the nose with what Hitchcock is saying? Even though John Dall, there are rumors, there never been confirmed that he was gay, although the assumption is that he was. And I think Farley Granger, there were also assumptions about his sexuality as well. I'm not well versed with Farley Granger.
Farley Granger, I think, finally did in the latter part of his life come out.
Okay.
You always have to speculate how much was known in Hollywood. Probably most people knew that Farley Granger was gay in Hollywood during this time. I don't know about John Dall. I think both of them have a sort of effete, I guess would be the way to put it. Because they're not really effeminate, but they're a little effete. The way that it plays in the film is that it's also this element of intellectual superiority and cultural superiority. They're both upper class. They're both obviously very well educated. You know, they went to Harvard. They went to prep school. They're very well dressed. All of that. But the undercurrent is very much that these are 2 gay men.
There's nothing simpering or fey about them, which is good. But I think Montgomery Clift, I think of something like him in The Heiress. Didn't The Heiress come out around the same time as this? I want to say it did.
Pretty close, yeah.
Pretty close. Monty Clift is always a really great con man. But I don't think for this he would have necessarily worked because there's always that detachment with Cliff. I forget who said it, but that he was so beautiful that you always felt really detached from his performances. And here you really need characters that are just unrepentant. He would have been an okay Philip, but I do not think he would have been a good Brandon.
Clift and Granger actually are fairly similar. First of all, just appearance, but then also an attitude. At that point, you almost want to flip the 2 of them and have Granger, who can play that range, playing a character more like Brandon, and have Clift playing Philip. I like Dall, and given that he made so few films, it's really nice that he made this film. Brandon really is the main villain in the whole piece, and he dominates the screen.
What makes John Dall's performance so unique. It's unlike anything that I've ever seen in a movie of this era, or really any classic era. I don't know anybody that has this gleeful menace about his actions. I love the macabre humor that John Dall has, and I'm sure that's aided by Hitchcock. You know, the swinging door. The door swings open, and you see him just standing there stock still, dropping the rope into this drawer. It's almost like an old cartoon way. There's just this childlike, and I don't even want to use the term childlike, because he knows what he's doing, this delight in his performance, this gleefulness. And it helps that John Dall doesn't have movie star good looks. He's good looking, but his face is not ethereally, like, pretty. When he's making these faces, again, it is very much like Christian Bale in American Psycho. This mugging, I think, is what I'm going for there. And we talk about strangers on a train, which I think is, to use the phrase, kissing cousin to this movie. You look at Robert Walker in that film. I haven't rewatched Strangers in a Train in a long time, but I don't remember being as drawn to Robert Walker's performance as I was here.
I think that Walker is a little more obviously unhinged. Even in the opening sequence between Walker and Granger, where he first proposes the crisscross, that whole dialogue, the way that Granger plays it and the way that Walker plays it is that Granger's kind of like, oh, this guy's a little weird and I'm just going to keep on humoring him until I can leave. Whereas Walker is obviously very, very serious. So Dall doesn't have that. Like, when all of the other characters come in, like, he stops being the killer or whatever, and he's sort of putting on this performance of being like, oh, I don't know where David is. Like, you buy his character. You buy that he's not crazy. He's not maniacal. And you would believe that all of these other characters who are surrounding him would just be like, oh, it's just Brandon. Brandon is just Brandon. You know, he's making jokes. He's being charming. He's being a little nasty, a little catty, but that's about it. Whereas Walker is much more, as soon as he opens his mouth, you're just like, there's something wrong with this guy.
With Robert Walker, and I think with Strangers on a Train, there's more of that noirish feeling to it. I don't get the noir feeling from this movie.
The murder takes place in broad daylight. I love that moment when he opens the curtains and the entire room lights up. There's a sunniness to a lot of the film. It's late afternoon and then goes straight into evening and then finally night. But for most of the film, the set is very bright, the clothes are very bright. It's this almost sunny, nearly like Trouble with Harry territory, the sunniness where all of this darkness is happening.
That segues us nicely into what I think Rope is really great at, which is the technique. I don't often champion Hitchcock's technique. I don't know why. I just don't naturally gravitate to like, ooh, look at what he's doing with shot composition. But here I really enjoy some of the things that he's doing. This is his first color film. For a movie like this, I tried to think of how it would be different, or if it would be different in black and white. And I think you really need the color, mostly because this is supposed to technically be in real time. So you need to have that changing colors of the background, the open windows, the sunset. You need all that in order to feel the time pass. Yeah. And also I think it just helps a lot in terms of highlighting these characters, the way that they look. I love the way that Farley Granger and John Dall are dressed. The way that Joan Chandler's character, who plays Janet, who is the girl of this movie. I love how everybody is composed, and I think you would really miss that in black and white. This movie already feels stagey, but if it had been in black and white, I think it would have been stagey and stagnant. I don't know. What do you think if it had been in black and white?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the colors contribute to it, and it seems very deliberate. It's not a lush film in the way that Vertigo is lush, or even Rear Window. But it does have that, like I say, the use of light. You would get it in black and white, but you wouldn't get the same contrast. And the same, like I say, the sunniness of it. Bright cheerfulness at the beginning as it descends into night. I would have to watch the exact scene again, but I noticed this when I was watching it the last time. There's the use of the lights outside. And there's flashing lights, there are...
I think it's when Cadell is holding the rope and there's that red light from the outside that's flashing.
And you just wouldn't get that in black and white at all. And I'm certain that Hitchcock would have employed something different in order to convey the feeling that he was going for. But as soon as he got a hold of color, he was like, okay, I'm going to use this. I'm going to see what I can do with the varying shades and the varying contrast that you can get in a color film. So he uses it really effectively. I didn't particularly notice the closeness of the costumes or anything like that, except that Brandon and Philip are dressed very similarly, and Kenneth and David, the brief shot that we get of David, and then when we actually see Kenneth, are also dressed very similarly. There's a sense of the doppelganger that keeps on getting repeated.
You actually brought up one of the points I had. Hitchcock has certain things that he loves to go back to. The color, the splashes of color. Yeah. You look at this in, like, Vertigo. The doppelganger with the fact that David and Kenneth look exactly the same. And I love that Brandon's whole technique is, I'll just get Janet to go back to Kenneth. It's almost like he's done her a favor. Or he's done Kenneth a favor more than anything else. Yeah. Hitchcock really is into reflections, windows, mirrors, things like that. And you have this big window, essentially, that's overarching the entire movie, that's always in view for the most part. Brandon mentions how he would have loved to have done this in the sunlight. I love the voyeuristic tone, that there are outside people watching. Again, this would all just come to fruition when he did Rear Window. Yeah. But the way the camera follows actors when their backs are turned, which is not something most Hollywood movies tended to do, have the camera behind, or in some instances the camera will just go away and look at something else completely, where the audience really feels like they're one with the movie, that they're involved in some way, that they are witness to it, which is another Hitchcock trope that he really likes.
Yeah, I've seen several people who have described this film as stagey, and it is based on a stage play, and it does only take place on a single set. But I think that the camera movement and the way that he uses those things like reflections, like the movement of the camera following characters, things like that, removes us from that sense of staginess. I never feel that it's like a stage play because there's very little of just, okay, we're now just going to watch the action. The camera is always focusing on one character doing something while the other characters are talking, sometimes off camera. There's that wonderful sequence of the maid beginning to collect all of the dishes and everything. She's taking everything off of the chest, and you've got the chest in the foreground and her in the background doing her work. And meanwhile, the characters are carrying on a conversation off camera that we're hearing, but all of the focus is on what is happening, because you know, as she begins to strip this chest, the more likely she is to open the chest and then reveal the body. It's so well done, and I think that it removes it from feeling like a stage play or feeling like it's just a filmed play, because the camera is so involved with what's going on.
And when I use the term stagey in this instance, I think it's more structure, because so much of the movie takes place in front of those windows that almost feel like the proscenium arch. Yeah. So I don't use the term stagey in this instance to mean like, oh, we're just watching a play writ large. Ask me to talk about watching the 1948 version of Hamlet, though, and I might talk about stagey in a derogatory sense. I'll have Lauren back on for that one.
We could talk about the way that Olivier uses a camera and the way that Hitchcock uses a camera. Thank you very much.
But here I use it in terms of the fact that you are watching all of this play out on this huge background that, yeah, technically the outside was a mat.
I think so.
It had to be, because it was all filmed on the set.
Yeah, and then it actually, if I remember correctly, during the filming, it was all filmed pretty much in sequence. There was very little editing. During the filming, it actually shifts. That's why you get, so the lights go down, and the clouds change, and the sunlight changes, and then you finally get New York at night.
You get this great stage idea of watching sets change without watching set changes, if that makes sense. Yeah. But the lengthy takes, I think, work for a movie where there's very sly editing. It's not all one take, but it's slyly edited. Yes. This movie sails through an hour and 25 minutes. A movie holds my attention if I'm not checking how long it is, because I feel I have adult onset ADD. I do that a lot. But I actually didn't start checking until at least 50 minutes in. I was like, oh, it's almost over? It's actually really great. The pacing here is awesome. I don't necessarily think he has the big cameo. I'm sure he's in this film in some form. I don't know if it's just like a picture or something. I'm guessing he's in here.
I'm trying to remember. I think that he is, but I can't remember where the cameo actually is.
But he does refer to himself, or at least his movies, several times. Cadell has that conversation with David's aunt, Mrs. Atwater, played by Constance Collier, where they're talking about, oh, I watched that movie with Grant and Bergman. It's called something. It's called Notorious. I really love that. And then they also reference James Mason, and it wouldn't be, I think, 11 years until James Mason would actually make North by Northwest, which is a Hitchcock film. So I love that Hitchcock is at least trying to break up the nihilism of the movie with a couple digs at himself.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of humor there. And I also like, in that particular scene, it's Jimmy Stewart is standing in the middle, listening to these women praise other famous male actors, like Cary Grant, many of whom have worked with Hitchcock. I just enjoy that little, like, he's sort of standing there going, like, okay.
We're going to talk about Jimmy Stewart in a second, because I have issues with him in this movie. Arthur Laurence actually brought up, and I wanted to get your opinion on this, because I'm of two minds about it. He claimed that Hitchcock originally didn't want to show the murder, which happens in about the first 30 seconds, and leave this ambiguity about whether they had done it and whether there was a corpse in the trunk or not. And I really think that that's inventive. But I think it might have ultimately diffused Brandon's villainy, because Brandon is so proud that he's done this. He really feels that he's superior. I think if the question was, is it a bluff, it would have diluted that. If Farley Granger was the lead, that might have done something, because you're watching Farley Granger be conflicted or at least scared about all of this. But I don't think it would have worked with the way that it's laid out now. I think you can't have ambiguity. I would have loved to see what that looks like, but I don't think it would have worked.
I don't see how you can have the ambiguity there, because part of the power of the film is that throughout the entire film, we know what is in the chest. We know that there's a dead body in the middle of the room the entire time, and that part of the tension, and Hitchcock once talked about, the idea that tension is created by showing the audience the bomb, showing the bomb being set, and then showing the character walk away, and then normal things happen in the room. But the tension comes from the entire time the audience knows there's a bomb under the table, and you don't know when it's going to go off. And that's the function of the body in Rope, is that you don't know when that chest is going to be open. And there are several times where they threaten to open it, and then it doesn't happen. So all of the excitement from watching the film is knowing that the person that they're talking about, they're talking about, where's David? Why hasn't David arrived? David's aunt refers to Kenneth as David. There's all of this shock. All of that tension comes from the fact that you know that David is dead and that he's lying in the middle of the room.
I'm all for Hitchcock wanting to play with ambiguity, and he's done that before with other movies. It works towards the cynicism of the characters for you to know there's no fooling. They're not just talking the talk. They actually did it.
And the murder is such a shocking moment. It's the beginning of the film. Like, you get the opening credits, you get the camera panning to the window, you hear the scream. Almost immediately, you're like, we get a close-up of a man's face as he's being strangled and falling limp. That's the first time that we see Philip and Brandon. Those are the first people that we see on screen. And it's a shockingly brutal moment. And then after that, there's no more violence at all. The most that you get is the gun going off. And that's it. And that's very powerful.
Speaking of going limp, I'm sorry, I had to do the poor pun. I'm sorry. We gotta talk about that thing that we always seem to talk about on Ticklish Business, homoeroticism. It's literally in every movie, at least I can argue,
There's
but
so
it's
much
more
of it.
so here. Actually, it's intentional here. I think it's come on. Okay, so the biggest question, is this Hitchcock's gayest film?
Yes, probably. There's a lot of maybe gayer characters. I mean, I specifically think of the Martin Landau character in North by Northwest, that whole relationship. Yes. But in terms of the whole arc of the film, yeah, definitely.
This was considered Hitchcock's most controversial. It was actually banned in several states because of the gay content. I mean, most people who watch this, regardless of whether you actively, I usually say certain movies you have to really look for it or argue it. It's pretty overt here. It's pretty overt from the opening scene. So after the murder, I think it's Philip who says, "What did you feel?" And Brandon goes on this extended soliloquy that feels like it's a sexual encounter. He mentions covering up signs so that nobody will know what they've done. It's probably the most homoerotic story. But I don't necessarily know, probably have to ask somebody of that sexual orientation how they feel about it. I don't think it's a positive portrayal of homosexuality if those characters are. But I don't necessarily think it's coming down on homosexuality. I think it's coming down more on male entitlement and that whole Nietzsche, Superman, Ubermensch thing than it is gay people are evil.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you could probably make an argument, and the argument has almost certainly been made that this is a homophobic film. I don't read it as one because of its complexity. And because what is evil about Brandon and Philip is their self-involvement. not their supposed sexuality or the potential of their sexuality. Hitchcock makes jokes all the time. Some of it is just some really dark jokes. Brandon opening up his cigarette case and lighting a cigarette after the murder's been committed. There are a couple of moments where, like, he just takes this deep breath and then lets it out, and you're like, this is very sexual. He's getting a release out of that. And I think that that's the other side of it, is that there's definitely Brandon is getting a sexual charge out of everything that is happening. Not just the murder, but the performance that he's putting on, showing himself to be so much better and so much superior to everyone. And that's definitely implied. But again, I'm not convinced that that just comes down to his presumed homosexuality.
If anything, I think this is just a sexual film. A lot of Hitchcock's films do have sexual overtones. I mean, you look at something like Notorious, or, again, even North by Northwest, which has a lot of sauciness to it. Hitchcock really likes pushing the boundaries of sexuality in his movies. Here it's just gay sexuality.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think that you read the film as, oh, they're evil because they're gay. But somebody could disagree with me, and they are welcome to send me that argument. If anything, the scene that always had me taken aback, especially both in terms of homoeroticism and just sexuality in general, is the chicken story.
Oh yeah, strangling chickens.
There's a whole section where they're talking about how Philip doesn't eat. He says chicken, but I thought the intention was he doesn't eat meat.
I'm not certain.
We're never really sure either way. There's no real indication. I thought it was like, oh, the concept that, like, gay people are vegetarian. I don't really know if that was what the thing was here. But he says, but Janet responds with, I've never heard of anyone who didn't eat chicken. I'm like, oh, okay, so we're gonna go with that logic. And then it leads to Brandon being like, I saw Philip once strangle a chicken. Again, there is, like, so much double meaning in this. But it goes back to that, the fact that Brandon gets this sexual release from it. It is kind of like the ultimate story of masturbation, because he's the only one that gets this, it's almost like an autoerotic response, whereas poor Philip is just, like, sickened by the whole thing.
Well, it's very heavily implied that Brandon is a sadist. So he likes even this vicarious thrill of seeing Philip kill a chicken is something that he enjoys. But to riff off of that, there's a scene later where Rupert actually says to Philip, well, you're lying when you say that you've never strangled a chicken, because I've seen you do it. In fact, you're very good at it. There's a very weird trifecta going on between Brandon, Philip, and Rupert, with sort of Philip being under Brandon's thumb and kind of rebelling against it, but then Brandon constantly wanting to impress Rupert, and then you have this whole relationship that the three of them have going at the same time.
And I think it's worth pointing out that Hitchcock is really into, like, sex and death, and it's not just limited to this. Psycho is all about sex and death. Sometimes in the same scene, I mean, depending on how you interpret certain things.
Yeah, repressed sexuality coming out in the form of murder. I mean, he even once said you need to film a murder like you film a love scene. And there's a great deal of dichotomy in a lot of Hitchcock's work of treating a love scene as though it's a killing, and treating a killing as though it's a love scene. And you get that in Notorious, which also talks about chicken, now that I think about it.
Yeah, oh my gosh. I'm starting to think Hitchcock just has an issue with chickens.
Well, there's also a food issue. There's a food, sex, and death issue going on.
That's true. That's very true. But the original play was obviously a lot gayer. They did have to strip significantly away at the original play. And one of the big things they got rid of was that Cadell, the Jimmy Stewart character, had a past affair with one of his students. And I don't know, did they say which one it is? Or is it just left that there's... I think so. It's just the implication is that he has had this relationship with one of the boys. I'm glad that's not included. It would have never been included, regardless. But it leads to my issue with Jimmy Stewart's character in this movie in general. Because if that was the only thing that's interesting about the character, I'd have been like, it's still unimportant. I don't like Jimmy Stewart in this movie. I think he is miscast. He thought he was miscast. He doesn't show up till about 28 minutes in. Movie's about an hour 25. They originally wanted Cary Grant, which I find even funnier that they're referencing, like, how much they love Cary Grant when Cary Grant was originally offered the role that Jimmy Stewart is just standing there accepting. For me, he doesn't have the analytical deducement that I think a Grant character would have just come in, he would have been, of course, he would have been suave and smooth, but he also would have had that ability to play with the cat and mouse angle a bit more. I don't get Stewart having that same amount of doggedness to him, and it culminates when he gives the big speech at the end of the movie, which I think he just plays so hammy. It's just so overwrought. I don't really care for it. I think he does that same concept better in Vertigo. I don't know. What do you think about Jimmy Stewart in this movie?
I have mixed feelings about Jimmy Stewart in general, particularly at this stage of his career, because we're getting into older Stewart. He's one of the things that both I love and hate about Vertigo. I mean, I think Grant would have been it would have been a very different part and a very different character if Grant had played it. He just would have played it differently. One of the things that I actually really like about the final speech and the way that Stewart delivers it is that there's this sense of him trying to convince himself that he has no responsibility. At one point, he even says, I want to thank you for showing me that my attitudes have been wrong. But the things that you have done is not at all what I've meant. You've twisted my words. And meanwhile, we've seen in an earlier scene of him, advocating murder. And he's doing it in kind of a jokey way. But he keeps on claiming that he's very, very serious. You're just like, so this kid, right? And you figured that he met these boys when they were adolescents. They twisted your words, but they also obviously didn't twist your words. In some way, his anger and the sort of intensity with which he presents it is he's trying to talk his way out of having any culpability in what these boys have done. And the fact is that he is culpable. And we've seen that he's culpable because we've seen his philosophy at work. I really like the way that he plays that because there's a certain hysteria to it. He's trying to enforce this sense that I'm not responsible, when the audience can say, well, you kind of are. And at some level, he kind of knows that he is. Because there's this implication that Brandon would never have thought of doing this if it wasn't for Cadell presenting it to him. I like his performance, particularly in the end of the film. I disagree. I do buy that he begins to figure out what is going on. He definitely figures out that something is wrong. He definitely figures out that Brandon is behaving in one way really odd, and Philip is behaving in a totally different way, but also very odd. He obviously knows that something is going on, and he's flying by the seat of his pants by the end of it. It's just like, something is wrong. You've done something to David, and I'm beginning to suspect about what that is. And I actually think that his sort of down-home folksiness plays well into that.
I can understand that. I think older Stewart is very different from younger Stewart. I'm almost tempted to wonder if they had gotten Jimmy Stewart maybe 10 years before, how this would have played. I have a lot of issues with him in Vertigo. I have a lot of issues with him in Rear Window that mostly are just my own. But it does lead to the ending, which is really unique. I'm going to say spoilers, but this movie is several decades old, so you should have seen it, or at least not care that spoilers exist. Of course, Cadell figures out everything, and his grand scheme is wouldn't make sense to kill them, so he just essentially shoots a gun out the window to draw the police to them. Effectively, they will spend the rest of their life in prison. And the movie ends essentially with Farley Granger's character saying they're coming, and it's this almost silent 3-minute ending of just watching the characters sit down and wait for their fate. It's the moment I think is very noirish in a movie that is not noirish, because it is that whole concept of waiting for death, waiting for fate to come and play its hand. I like that it's quiet and contemplative, and I like that it ends again on this very cynical yet realistic ending. I mean, it had to end with the killers getting their comeuppance because that's what the code would have dictated. But you're just left to sit there, again, the audience being culpable, having witnessed all of this. You're left to sit there and contemplate what you've seen. It's a very bleak ending, but I don't know any other movie that's ended that way.
You don't at all get the payoff of having the cops come in and having them being arrested or anything like that. You don't really get to see them. You know that they're going to be punished, but you don't really get to see them being punished. And Hitchcock does like to play with audience culpability, and I think that having shown us the killing, having allied us so closely with the murderers for so long, and in fact, there's even this sense of, we don't want the body to be discovered for a long time, because if it is, then the movie's over, the story's ended. And he plays with that all the time. So then you get to the gunshots. which are the next moment of violence. The first moment is the very beginning of the film, and the end of the film is the second moment of violence. And you get these gunshots, which is basically the explosion. Finally, all of the tension has been released. We know what's going to happen, and suddenly we're sort of snapped back to being in this position of seeing all this, being like, these guys are going to go to prison, they're probably going to be executed. This isn't really happy. Nothing is happy about this. There's not really any satisfaction in knowing that the murderers are going to be punished. I agree with you that it's a very bleak ending, but it's sort of the only way that that movie can end.
Overall, I always tend to separate movies that I don't know if I'd watch regularly into movies I appreciate. Rope, because it's so unique in so many different ways, is unique to me in that I do appreciate what Hitchcock's doing. It's the Hitchcock movie that I think I can deconstruct a lot of Hitchcock movies. There are certain movies that I think always give me layers to look at. Notorious is a great one. It's a movie where, you kind of want to rewatch it and look at each character's individual reaction to things throughout, how they change. John Dall is utterly compelling. I mean, it's amazing to watch him. It's shocking that this movie did not get any nominations for him. It actually didn't get any Academy Award nominations the year it came out, which is surprising because it's Hitchcock, but it shouldn't be surprising because Hitchcock, he got the Best Picture for Rebecca, right? But never director?
Yeah, never won a director. I think that some of his films won other awards, but he never actually got a Best Director.
And this was, again, not critically and commercially loved upon release in 48, maybe because it was just ahead of its time. I think that it's shocking to say, but shocking that in 1948 you're getting this movie that is about as frank with homosexuality as you can get. Something that's not The Children's Hour. But it's worth watching. I'm glad that I watched it again with full attention this time. It's not my favorite Hitchcock film, but in the movies where Hitchcock strangles somebody, I like this a lot more than I did Dial M for Murder, so I call that a win. Lauren, what do you think about Rope?
Well, I've said this before. Rope is not my favorite Hitchcock film. It is one of my favorites, and it is one that I go back to numerous times. I think I've seen it at least 10 times now. And one of the reasons is solely because I love Hitchcock. I love the way that Hitchcock uses the camera. The camera is so active in this film. And in fact, even just rewatching it this time, I was like, wait a minute, was that a cut? Did he cut? He suddenly cut. Wait, I've got to go back. I've got to see how we got from point A to point B. That I find very exciting, and that's the sort of thing that I like to study anyways. But more than that, the performances really are amazing. John Dall in particular, I just love him. He's so, like you say, compelling to watch. There's almost an Altman-esque tendency with this film, with the camera focusing on one thing and the characters talking about another, that if you really try to pay attention to the dialogue and what characters are saying to one another, you pick up these little jokes, these little asides, these little, people being normal, but then also these hints that are happening about, Brandon is constantly hinting that he's committed a murder. He's enjoying the hell out of it. That's very Hitchcockian and very funny in some level, but it also really enriches the whole experience of the film. Hitchcock referred to this as a failed experiment, and I actually think it's one of his most successful experiments. Far more successful than, Dial M for Murder or Lifeboat. And it kind of precedes what he would ultimately do with some of his later films, like with Psycho.
You can let me know your thoughts on Rope, John Dall, homoeroticism, whatever you want to send to me. You can email it to me at ticklishbiz@gmail.com, or you can tweet it to @ticklish_biz, and I'll read it on the next episode. We're not going to say goodbye to Lauren completely because she's going to be back on the next episode to talk about Gun Crazy, but where can fans find to get in touch with you online in the meantime?
They can get in touch with me on Twitter @LHBusiness.
That's going to close out this edition of Ticklish Business. As always, there are multiple places you can listen to Ticklish Business, either directly at ticklishbusiness.podbean.com, via Stitcher Radio and Player FM, or on iTunes. If you are listening via iTunes, please consider helping the podcast out by leaving a rating or review. As always, you can contact me directly with questions, comments, suggestions to ticklishbiz, that's biz, @gmail.com, or visit me at my official website where I discuss classic films regularly, journeysinclassicfilm.com. And the podcast is also on Twitter at ticklish_biz. Want to learn more about upcoming episodes or hear exclusive content before anyone else? Then consider supporting Ticklish Business via Patreon. I have a wealth of amazing perks, and all your donations go right back into making Ticklish Business the premier classic film podcast that it is. Also, anyone who becomes a patron in the month of May is eligible for a secret prize from the Ticklish Biz Vault. And in case you've been on the fence about joining the Ticklish Business Patreon, just know in the coming weeks, I'm going to be posting my interview with Michael Cortes biographer Alan K. Rohde. I'm also going to be posting my TCM Film Festival content there first. And I am in the process of starting 2 supplementary bonus shows that you will only be able to listen to on Patreon. So if you want to find out more about what I'm doing there, definitely check out patreon.com/ticklishbiz. Want to learn more about the stars turning 100 this year? Well, if you're a member of TCM's exclusive fan club, TCM Backlot, you can read my year-long series about the stars spotlighted on the show. It's called Centennial Celebrations, and I discuss films and information about the stars that we don't have time to talk about on the show, so definitely check that out at tcmbacklot.com. But next time, Lauren Humphries-Brooks joins me one more time to talk about John Dall before we close out the month of May. I know, doing things a bit later than I anticipated, but, scheduling. So we're going to be talking about John Dall's second most famous film, the 1950 film noir, Gun Crazy. Until next time.